is not true, it can lead to lie. So we expose it. Whoa.
Tonight, I want to walk carefully through a sensitive issue using named sources. This presentation is called Sources, Interpretation, and Child Protection. It is a comparative look at three things: Hadith's reports, Quran 65:4, and biblical ethics on protecting the vulnerable. The purpose here is simple: to map the primary citations being discussed and to ask what kind of moral vision these texts create. The tone matters. This is a critique of ideas and sources, not an attack on Muslims as people. And because this topic involves children, I want to handle it with seriousness and restraint. This presentation is educational and comparative. It is built around primary sources and ethical questions. What this presentation is, it is a guided map to the named citations in Hadith, the Quran, and the Bible. It is a moral question. What do these texts encourage when it comes to protecting the vulnerable? And it is a prompt to read sources directly, instead of relying on clips, rumors, or social media fragments. What this presentation is not. It is not a blanket attack on Muslims as people. It is not a call to insult, harass, or demean anyone. We will stay at the level of citations, interpretation, and ethics. These are the primary Islamic citations most often discussed in this debate. First, Sahih al-Bukhari, 5133. This report is commonly summarized as saying the marriage contract happened at age 6 and consummation at age 9. Second, Sahih Muslim, 1422c. This report gives a slightly different starting age, 7, but still says 9 for when she was taken as a bride, and it includes the detail that her dolls were with her. Third, Sunan an-Nasa'i, 3378. This report repeats the 6 and 9 pattern and adds the line, "I used to play with dolls." Fourth, Sahih al-Bukhari, 6130. This also includes the dolls detail, saying, "I used to play with dolls" in the Prophet's presence. So the debate is not built on one random narration. It is built on multiple major collections that preserve the same basic picture. This narrows in on one internal feature of the narrations, the dolls detail. Why does that matter? Because the dolls are not just background decoration. They shape how the story is framed. They present Aisha with explicitly childlike activity. That becomes important in the later debate, because some modern defenses argue that Aisha must have been older. But the narrations themselves include a detail that sounds unmistakably childlike. This is why the discussion is not only about chronology or math, it is also about what the text itself is doing. On Sunan.com, there is even an editorial note citing Fath al-Bari, explaining that dolls were allowed because she had not yet reached puberty. So, the debate is not only external, it is internal to the sources themselves. Now we move from Hadith to the Quran itself. This is Quran 65 verse 4 in Surah At-Talaq. The key phrase often discussed is, "those who have not menstruated." This verse is about categories in waiting periods after divorce. Critics point to this verse and argue that it reflects a broader legal framework, not just one narrative report. In other words, they argue that the issue is not only in Hadith, it also appears in Quranic legal categories. Classical tafsir discussions, including Ibn Kathir, have historically connected this clause to those who have not yet begun menstruation. Now, defenders answer this differently. They argue the verse is about divorce procedure, and that the categories are interpreted in more than one way. But this is why the verse matters so much in the debate. It becomes part of the larger question: what kind of legal and moral framework is being presented? This gives a high-level map of the tension. On the plain reading critique side, multiple major collections report the same ages. The doll's detail reinforces a childlike framing. And if Muhammad is treated as a model for all time, then what is defended in him may be copied by followers. That makes moral evaluation unavoidable. On the common defenses side, some question the reliability or interpretation of certain reports. Some offer alternative chronologies that place Aisha older. Some argue that Quran 65 verse 4 should be read differently. And some appeal to historical norms, while still rejecting harm today. So, this is the real tension. Plain reading versus reinterpretation, and moral pressure versus textual authority. Now the presentation turns toward the Bible's moral emphasis. The core biblical theme here is protection, justice, and advocacy. Psalm 82:3-4 says, "Defend the weak, rescue the needy." Isaiah 1:17 says, "Seek justice, defend the oppressed." Proverbs 31:8-9 says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves." Notice the direction of these texts. They do not train people to excuse troubling behavior in the powerful. They train people to protect the vulnerable. This takes that biblical ethic and focuses it through Jesus himself. In Matthew 19:14, Jesus says, "Let the little children come to me. Do not hinder them." That is welcome. That is value. That is protection. Then in Matthew 18:6, Jesus gives a severe warning. If anyone causes one of these little ones to stumble. The point is not softness without seriousness. It is love with moral warning. In the New Testament framing, holiness is aligned with protecting children and warning against harm. So the contrast becomes very clear. The weak are not to be explained away. They are to be defended. This part is here to keep the conversation serious and respectful. First, when moral intuition and textual authority conflict, what rules should guide interpretation? In other words, what do we do when a plain reading feels morally wrong, but a tradition treats the text as authoritative? Second, how should hadith reliability be evaluated, especially when the hadith is used to set norms for all time? What standards are being applied, and are they applied consistently? Third, how do different tafsir traditions interpret Quran 65:4, and why do they differ? What assumptions are brought to the verse, and how do those assumptions shape the conclusion? Fourth, what moral vision about children is emphasized in the Bible passages we cited? What patterns do we see in Scripture's treatment of the weak and the vulnerable? Fifth, what does protecting the vulnerable look like in real communities today? Not just in theory, but in laws, safeguards, and everyday practice. These aren't throwaway questions. They go to the heart of how people read, defend, or challenge religious authority, and how those choices shape moral outcomes. This final section is simple. Go read the sources for yourself. The hadith references used here are Sahih al-Bukhari 5133, Sahih Muslim 1422c, Sunan an-Nasa'i 3378, Sahih al-Bukhari 6130. The Quranic reference is Quran 65:4, and the related tafsir reference is Ibn Kathir on 65:4. The biblical references are Matthew 19:14, Matthew 18:6, Psalm 82:3-4, Proverbs 31:8-9, and Isaiah 1:17. So the goal of this presentation is not to end with anger. It is to end with clarity. This is not hate for people. It is a question for the sources, and it is a line for children. The issue is not whether people can argue. The issue is what the sources say, how they have been understood, and what kind of moral vision they create. If sacred texts are used to shape conscience, then conscience has to ask whether the weak are being defended or explained away. And when we compare these citations, the contrast becomes clear. One set of texts raises hard moral questions, while the Bible repeatedly calls people to defend, protect, and speak for the vulnerable. That is why this conversation matters. So what you're about to hear is not meant to stir hatred toward people. It's meant to lay the citations out plainly and to press one central question. If guidance is truly holy and for all time, Should it ever require excuses where children are involved? This song is a documentary-style summary of the sources we just walked through, and a call to read them carefully, think clearly, and draw a firm line for the vulnerable.
I stayed up late just trying to understand. Not hunting for drama, just truth in my hands. They said if you want the facts, don't chase the street. Go to the books we trust, the ones we keep. So I opened Sahih al-Bukhari, the one they prize. Then Sahih Muslim, the second they cite. I'm not quoting enemies, I'm not twisting lines. I'm reading what's printed, word for word in time.
And the first shock drops, plain and direct. Bukhari says 6, Muslim says 7. 2 starts, 1 story, and both get defended.
6, 7, that's what their records say. Not a rumor, not a meme, not a clip on replay. If this is guidance for everyone across every land, why does a child's age sit right there in the plan?
6, 7.
And I'm asking you straight, if truth is holy, why protect what we call abuse today? Then the details turn the volume up in the same breath. But Sahih Muslim says our dolls are with her. Sunan and Asadi repeats, it's still 6, still 9. And as I used to play with dolls in the same line. And Sahih Bukhari says it too in another place. I used to play with dolls right in his presence. So don't tell me growing the report show toys. That's childhood language, that's a little girl's voice.
And now the second number lands like a verdict. Not maybe, not later, the story says 9.
And no century makes that clean. A child is a child in every human scene. If you say example for all time, then time will test what you excusing the prophet. The world will repeat its best. 9. And my conscience won't bend. If God is holy, this should never be defended. Now I hear the martyr rescue, she was older, relax. A safer sounding story built with timeline math. But here's the contradiction you can't just erase. You're fighting the numbers while keeping the dolls in place. If you keep Bukhari and Muslim as your goal, you don't get to rewrite them when the claim turns cold. And if you say the plain reading can't be true, then admit the foundation shifts when pressure comes through. And even the Quran Surah at Talaq 64 speaks of waiting periods for those who have not menstruated. A category the old commentaries apply to the very young. That's a system, not an accident, openly written. But
Scripture speaks protection when it talks about the weak. Defend the helpless, speak for those who can't speak. Jesus welcomed children, warned against harm in the least. So holiness looks like shelter, not childhood. Breathe.
this isn't hate for people. It's a question for the sources and a line for children.